Every single answer Matsumoto gives us simply spawns a dozen more questions. Hello, my wonderful viewers, and welcome to another episode of Betty Adams Overanalyzes. Today we are going to take a look at one of the biggest questions in Kaiju number 8, a question that has stayed around for over 100 chapters. What is Little Guy? What is or what was that little kaiju that crawled down Kafka's throat and started this whole thing off? This question has always been paired with another question: why Kafka? It chose Kafka. Little Guy made an active choice to claim Kafka as its host way back in chapter 1. So we have these two big questions. What is Little Guy, and why did it choose Kafka? Well, we have the answer to the first of that questions. There will be spoilers through chapter 117. So if you don't want those, I'll give you a chance to click away now. You can go check out the links below the video to get yourself a copy of my book, Humans Are Weird. I have the data, a collection of short, absurd science fiction stories. What is Little Guy? That's the question we have the answer to. Moreover, this is as far as you can get from being a Deus Ex Machina answer. Everything that goes into this answer has been laid out clue by clue from chapter 1, seeded throughout the chapters up till now. So if you remember, the kaiju weapons are able to fuse with the human hosts. Humans are able to take kaiju weapons and harness their power. Not all humans, just some humans. And some of them, like Jin Narumi, are really, really good at it. Some can barely do it. But up until Kafka had walked onto the stage, Hoshin had never seen a 0%, so this has something to do with just being alive. So these kaiju, many of which are parasites, seem to have some affinity for the flesh, for the bodies of other beings, that allows this merger to happen, at least on some level, with essentially all humans. But when this happens, the kaiju weapons pick up the emotional imprint of their past users. We saw this in the ghost of Kokoru's mother showing up in weapon number 4, and Narumi mentions it with other previous weapons users. And then we see, of course, the kaiju themselves, their thoughts, their judgments, linger on in their tissues, not just counting kaiju number 10, who was technically still alive when he was transformed. But we get the pride that Director Baldi mentions when Kikoru's father is fighting, and we get Kikoru having to face down kaiju number 4 herself, or rather the ghost of kaiju number 4. So it's been well established that these kaiju can A, fuse with humans, and B, preserve the thoughts and emotions and attitudes of both the human and the kaiju. Then we have another concept. Certain kaiju can absorb not only humans, but other dead kaiju, and absorb their memories, their thoughts, to make themselves stronger, faster, smarter. That's how kaiju number 9 became what he was. He was a relatively physically weak kaiju who was psychically attracted to and then absorbed by a stronger kaiju. And kaiju number 9 managed to preserve his mental independence, but he was unable to physically break away from this other kaiju. And this kaiju is shown as being existing deep underground and comprised of thousands and thousands of kaiju, even before kaiju number 9 found him. So again, this absorbing of other life forms, it's shown to be something that's just inherent to kaiju. And then, of course, that also firmly established that some kaiju have a psychic ability to communicate telepathically. That is how the Mega Kaiju lured kaiju number 9 down to him, down into that cave. Now, then we get the history lesson. The history lesson that we got way back in around chapter 70 about this great kaiju attack from 1657, based on a very real-life fire that destroyed the Tokyo area in 1657, leading to the building of real-life shrines. But we see Kafka and Hoshin at the shrine, and that's where Kafka sees his first kaiju ghost. And we're like, what is that? But during the during that scene, Hoshina describes what happens here. You have a bunch of human warriors using a primitive form of kaiju weapons. And we see that one image there. We see them using cannons and firearms and pole axes. But then, in chapter 117, we get that developed. Those weapons that they were using, the pole arms they were using, were fused with their bodies in a similar way to modern era weapons, but were much more damaging to the bodies because they had to use just plain kaiju tissue. They are basically giving their bodies an infection, in which their bodies would have fought off, of course, and the kaiju tissue is trying to take over the human bodies. So they're basically poisoning themselves to make warriors out of themselves to protect their homes. Now, you have to be pretty desperate to do something like that, and they were. And these old kaiju-based weapons, wielded by these very desperate warriors, desperate to protect their homes, their families, they still had the ability, the humans weren't doing very well with them, but the kaiju tissue still had that ability to absorb and preserve the mental imprints of the warriors. So when these humans died, just slaughtered by the giant kaiju, that desperation to protect their homes, their families, and their brothers in arms, it was all preserved in their kaiju weapons as their bodies fell into the ground and was absorbed one little piece after the other into a new kaiju. A kaiju that, like a 17-year cicada, went underground and collected. So you have to imagine all these little fragments of kaiju tissue spilling out of the blood of these fallen warriors into the ground. They slowly came together. They somehow avoided being absorbed by the larger absorption kaiju. And this became the larvae that would become Little Guy. Now, how long did this take? We don't know. That's not answered. We know that Little Guy was still in a semi-larval form when we see him at 400 years later at the beginning of chapter 1, or at the middle of chapter 1, rather. And he doesn't seem to have, this little larval kaiju doesn't seem to have any much greater intelligence than you would expect a newly hatched egg to. Just enough to find Kafka, communicate to him, and burrow into his heart. Why did this take 400 years? We don't know. Why did Little Guy choose Kafka? Again, we still don't know. Now we can speculate. Perhaps Kafka was clearly, when Little Guy found him, he was in that same state of defiance and despair that the Little Guy's previous hosts had been in when they were being slayed by the kaiju. That feeling of helplessness and desperation to do something, actively trying to protect while failing utterly. So Kafka was in a headspace that this new hatched larva would recognize. He's like, oh yeah, there is frantic desperation and hopelessness, but someone not giving up. That was the last imprint of all those human warriors on the parasitic kaiju bits that would become the larval Little Guy. Perhaps since Little Guy whenever he woke up, this was the first time he'd found that exact mix of utter desperation, utter helplessness, and determination to go on. Then again, maybe there's a genetic aspect to it. Maybe Kafka is the descendant, a direct descendant of one of the warriors we saw fall in the battlefield that day. The warrior was fairly heavily armored. Giving that level of armor implies a certain level of training, and a certain level of training implies a certain age. So it's entirely possible that guy's son survived him, and then and the genes got passed down in a pure enough state for Little Guy to recognize. But then again, why wouldn't Hoshina have been chosen? One option, Hoshina was never out and about where Little Guy could find him, and was never in that mental state of desperation and hopelessness, and was never around without being already hooked up with a whole bunch of other kaiju tissues around him, which would have turned the Little Guy off. We know that the Little Guy does not respond well to what would appear to be a high-powered kaiju, which is what a high-powered defense force officer would appear to him as. Perhaps it was a combination. Kafka had the right genetics. He was a descendant of one of the warriors who fell in the battlefield. Given the number of generations that have passed, it's possible that he's a direct or indirect descendant of multiple of the soldiers who fell in the battlefield. He was in the right headspace for the telepathic little guy to identify him as the kind of warrior he was looking for. And he was just there, on the ground, dealing with the kaiju. But then all of that is speculation. We still don't know how long it took. Was little guy a 400-year cicada having to grow from like individual cells spread throughout the dirt and then bursting out of the ground when he hatched? Has little guy been awake for hundreds of years, choosing hosts and then leaving them when they die to move on? We don't know. Has the little guy been wandering aimlessly for hundreds of years or maybe decades? Impossible to say. So we still don't know why little guy chose Kafka, but we do know what little guy is. Little guy is physically a combination of parasitic kaiju cells that were interacting with human cells. So little guy is physically a fusion of the human and the kaiju. Mostly kaiju cells with some absorbed human DNA put in there, it looks like. Psychically, he's the opposite. He is psychically, little guy is mostly human will with some kaiju instincts mixed in. Little guy has the last remaining psychic imprint of an entire band of warriors. Kill kaiju. The framework that little guy works that will through is a kaiju framework. So that is what little guy is. Physically, a kaiju with a human taint. Mentally, human will with a kaiju taint. For some reason, little guy was looking for a host and found Kafka. I'm certainly looking forward to next week when the new chapter drops. What do you think of my theory? Do you think I've missed anything important? Or is this a really good summary of what little guy is? Tell me what you think in the comments below the video. It's really great to hear your theories. Hit that like and subscribe button, and peace out, my wonderful viewers.
Step into a world of science and of story, of laughter and of tears. Betty Adams has crafted entire worlds of science fiction and science fantasy adventure in her Humans Are Weird series and in her Dying Embers series. Be prepared to laugh, cry, and become absorbed. Check out her books at the links below the video.